natural expression was gloomy and sad, although she genuinely looked like someone who smiled a lot. She would sniffle every once in a while and occasionally glance back in the rearview mirror to look back at her son in the back seat, who was hunched over partially, his arms held tight around his chest and his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance. Anyone could blandly see that something was wrong with him. His messy brown hair went in every which way, and his pale, almost gray skin was brought out by the luminescent lightning. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother, and he wore a t-shirt and scrub pants that he provided to him by the hospital. The clothes he had worn before were so shredded and blood-stained that they weren't wearable anymore. The right side of his face bared a few cuts along with his split eyebrow. His arms were bandaged all the way up to his shoulder, which had been shredded when his right side had hit the shattered glass. His injuries appeared to be painful, when really he couldn't feel a thing. He could never feel a thing. That was just one of the glories about being him, one of the many challenges he had to face growing up. Was growing up with a rare disease that caused him to completely numb towards pain. Never before had he felt himself get hurt. He could have lost a long arm and felt nothing. That and another major disorder he had to face was the one that deemed him many insulting nicknames in the short time he attended grade school. Before he was moved to homeschooling was his Tourette's syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch every once in a while. Kids would tease him and call him Ticci Toby, and mock him with exaggerated twitching and laughing. It got so bad that he turned to homeschooling. It was too hard for him to be in a common learning environment with seemingly every kid poking, or more like stabbing, fun at him. Toby stared blankly out the window. His face was empty of any depictable emotions, and every few minutes his shoulder, arm, or foot would twitch. Every bump that the car tire hits made his stomach turn. Toby Rogers was the boy's name, and the last time Toby remembered riding in a car was when it crashed. That's all he thought about, unconsciously replaying everything he had remembered before he blacked out, over and over again. Toby had been the lucky one, when his sister hadn't been so lucky. When the thought of his older sister came, he couldn't help but let his eyes begin to tear up. The horrible memories were playing in his mind, her screaming that had been cut off when the front of the car was smashed in. It all went blank for a moment before Toby opened his eyes to see his sister's body. Her forehead pierced with glass shards, her hip and legs were crushed under the force of the steering wheel, her torso pushed in from the late inflated airbag. This was the last thing he had seen of his dear old sister. The road home continued on for what seemed like forever. It took so long to get home due to his mother's wanting to avoid passing the site of the crash. When the surrounding gave him into a familiar neighborhood, they had both been more than ready to get out of the car and step back into their own home. It was an older neighborhood, with the quaint little houses all next to each other. The car drove in front of the little blue house with white window panes. They both quickly noticed the old vehicle that was parked in front of the house, and the familiar figure who stood up in the driveway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration taken over him by the sight of his father who wasn't there. His mother pulled the car out into the driveway beside him before turning off the engine and preparing to step out and face her husband. "Why is he here?" Toby said quietly as he looked back at his mother, who reached to open the car door. "He's your father, Toby. He's here because he wants to see you," his mother responded with a monotone voice, trying to sound less shaky. Yet he couldn't have driven up to the hospital to see Lyra before she died. Toby narrowed his eyes out the window. "He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive." "Yeah. When is he not?" Toby pushed open the door before his mother stumbled out into the driveway, where he met his father's gaze before looking down at his feet with a stern expression. His mother stepped out behind him and met her husband's eyes before walking around the car. His father opened his arms, expecting a hug from his wife, but she walked past him and put her arm around Toby's shoulder and influenced him to begin walking inside. "Connie," her husband began to say under a raspy voice. "What? No welcome home hug? Huh?" She ignored her husband's obnoxious words and walked past him with her son under her arm. "Hey, he's 16. He can walk by himself." His father began to follow them in. "He's 17. Connie glared back at him before opening the door to the house and stepping inside. "Toby, why don't we get you in your room to rest, okay? I'll come get you when dinner is ready." "No, I'm 16. I can walk by myself," Toby said sarcastically, and glared back at his father before stumbling up the small staircase and turning into his room, where he slammed the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it. Just a small bed, a dresser, a window, and his walls had a few framed pictures of his family. Back when they were a family. Before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently towards the rest of his family. Toby remembered when he was arguing with his mother, and he grabbed her by the hair and shoved her to the floor. And when Lyra had tried to break it up, he pushed her, and she hit her back on the corner of the kitchen counter. Toby could never forgive him for what he did to his mother and sister. Never. Toby didn't care how much his father beat him down. He couldn't feel it anyways. What he did care about was how he intentionally hurt the only two people he cared about. And when he was waiting in the hospital where his sister took her last few breaths, the only person who didn't rush there was his dad. Toby stood by the window and looked out onto the street. Could have sworn he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but quickly blamed it on the medication he had been put on. When dinner time had come around and his mother called him up to him, Toby came down the stairs and hesitantly sat down at the table across from his father, and in between his mother at the empty chair. It was quiet as his parents picked at their food, but Toby refused to eat. Instead, he just watched his dad with a blank stare. His mother caught his gaze towards his father and elbowed him slightly. Toby looked over at her slightly and looked down at his uneaten food, in which he didn't touch. Toby laid in bed. He pulled his covers over his head and stared at the window. He was tired, but there was no way he would fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He had been debating on whether or not to follow his mother's directions and forgive his father, or continue holding a grudge with his boiling hatred. He heard his door creak open and his mother padded into the room and sat on his bed next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. "I know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand. But I promise you, it will get better," she said softly. "When is he going to leave?" Toby said with an innocent tone in his shaky voice. Connie let her gaze fall down to her feet. I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know," she replied. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm near his chest. After a few minutes of silence, his mother sighed before she leaned in to kiss his cheek instead of to walk out of the room. "Good night," she said as she closed the door. The hours passed slowly, and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning. Every time he let his imagination take over, he heard the screeching of tires and the screaming of his sister, and he could uncontrollably jerk in bed. He threw off his covers laying on his back. He pulled his pillow over his face and cried into it. He could feel his chest rise and fall as he let out a shaky breath as he cried. He could hear his own pitiful weeping. He would have been screaming and crying if he didn't press his pillow over his face. After a few seconds, he threw the pillow off his face, as well as sat up, hunched over, holding his head and breathing roughly, tears streaming down his face. He couldn't help but cry. He tried to keep it in, but he couldn't help but whine and whimper as he sat there shaking. He inhaled before he stood up and walked around his bed to the window and peered out, taking deep breaths, trying to calm down. He rubbed his eyes and looked out at the group of tall pine trees across the street. He stopped suddenly as his gaze slowly centered on something standing under the streetlight. He heard ringing in his ears as he couldn't look away. The figure stood beside the streetlight about 2 feet shorter than it, long arms draped at its side as it stared up with non-existent eyes. The figure had no features whatsoever. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, yet it held Toby's hypnotized stare, seemingly peering into his very being. The ringing in his ears grew louder and louder each second he stared, before suddenly it went all black. The next morning, Toby woke up in his bed. He felt different. He wasn't tired at all, and when he consciously woke up, it felt like he had been lying there awake for hours. He had no thought flowing through his mind. He sat up slowly and stumbled over to the wall, but when he stood up, he automatically felt dizzy. He stumbled to the doorway and walked down the stairs. His parents were sitting at the table. His father was in tune with the small TV that sat on the countertop, and his mother was reading the newspaper. She quickly looked over when she felt Toby's presence looming behind her. "Well, good morning, sleepyhead. You've been sleeping forever," she greeted him with a hesitant smile. Toby slowly looked over at the clock and noticed that it was 12:30 p.m. "I made you breakfast, but it got cold. I was going to wake you, but I felt you needed sleep." Her expression fell from happy to worried as her son resisted responding to her. "Are you all right?" Toby stumbled over to sit by his father. He felt as if he was on idle. He had no control over his actions. He was seeing everything he did, but he didn't seem to register in his brain properly. He reached out to his father's arm, but his hand ended up being slapped. His father turned to him abruptly and pushed his chair over with his foot. "Don't touch me, boy," he yelled. His mother stood up. "All right, knock that off. This is the last thing we need." The day went by, and things continued on as they were. Connie spent most of her time cleaning up the house, and her rude husband spent most of the time ordering her around. It was just how it used to be before the crash. Toby never really left his room. He would sit by his bed and tremble. His mind would wander, but his thoughts changed to be too fast to be remembered. He would pace around in his small room like a caged animal, or stare out the window. The unhealthy cycle continued. Connie continued to be pushed around by her husband, being way too submissive to him. Toby remained in his room. Before he could think twice, he'd begin to chew on his hands, tearing the flesh from his fingers. He would gnaw on his hand until they bled. When his mother walked in on him while he was doing so, she reacted horribly. She rushed him downstairs and grabbed the first aid, wrapping his hand in it. She demanded that he wouldn't leave her side from then. He isolated himself so much that he grew to hate being around others. His memories grew glitchy as well. He started missing memories of minutes, hours, days, and so on. He'd begin talking nonsense about things completely unrelated to the conversation he would have. He'd go off about seeing things, sharks in the sink as he washed the dishes, hearing crickets in his pillow, and seeing ghosts outside his bedroom window. All the nonsense landed him in a counselor's office. His mother grew too anxious about his mental health. She decided it would be good for him to talk to a professional about what he was feeling. Connie walked Toby into the building, holding his hand and guiding him in. She walked him up to the front desk and began talking to the lady who sat behind him. "Miss Rogers?" the lady asked. "Yes, that's me." Connie nodded. "We're here to see Dr. Oliver. I'm here with Toby Rogers." Yes, right this way." The lady stood up and led them down a long hallway. Toby looked at the framed artwork down the halls and turned into the sound of the lady's high heels on the hardwood floor. She opened the door to a room with a table and 2 chairs. "If we can get him to sit in here for a few minutes, I'll get the doctor." She smiled and held the door open. Toby stumbled into the room and sat down at the table. He looked over at his mother and the lady before the door slowly shut behind him. He looked around the room before he held up his tightly bandaged hand and began to bite at the bandages to unwrap his hand. But he was interrupted as the door swung open and a young woman in a black and white spotted dress and light blonde hair stepped in, holding a clipboard and a pen. "Toby?" she asked with a smile. Toby looked up at her and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Toby. My name is Dr. Oliver." She put her hand out for him to shake, but hesitantly pulled away when she noticed his bandaged hands. "Oh," she smiled nervously before clearing her throat and sitting in the chair across the table from him. "So I'm going to ask you a few questions. Try to answer them as honestly as possible, okay?" She placed her clipboard down on the table. Toby nodded slowly and held his restrained hands in his lap. "How old are you, Toby?" 17, he responded quietly. She wrote that down on a paper that was clipped to the clipboard. "What's your full name?" "Toby Aaron Rogers." "What is your birthday?" "April 28th. "Who is your immediate family?" Toby paused for a minute before answering her question. "My mom, my dad, and..." He stopped. My sister." "I heard about your sister, dear. I'm really sorry." Her expression faded into a sad, pity-filled look. Toby nodded. "Do you remember anything from the crash, Toby?" Toby looked away from her. His mind went blank for a moment. He looked down at his lap, and in the surrounding, he heard a faint ringing noise. His eyes widened as he froze in place. "Toby?" the counselor asked. "Toby, are you listening?" Toby felt a shiver go down his spine until he froze once again and slowly looked over out the little window through the door. When he saw it, a dark, featureless figure peering in at him. He stared, eyes widened, the ringing growing louder and louder until suddenly the loud voice of the counselor broke his trance. "Toby!" she yelled. Toby jumped and fell sideways out of his chair and back into the corner. Dr. Oliver stood up, holding her clipboard to her chest, a surprising look in her eyes. Toby met her eyes again, his breathing hitching as he twitched. That night, Toby laid in bed, his eyes dazed as he stared straight up at the ceiling. He could feel himself beginning to doze off when he heard the scattering of footsteps down his hallway. He sat up and looked towards the doorway. His door was wide open. There was no light. Everything was lit by the luminescent blue glow of the moon through his window, leaving a cold lightning. He stood up and slowly made his way towards the doorway when suddenly the door, which was previously wide open, slammed in his face. He gasped and fell back. He was out of breath when he hit the ground and began breathing heavily, his eyes wide open, waiting for a few seconds before getting back up on his feet. He reached out and grasped the cold door handle with his bandaged hand and creaked it open. He looked out into the dark hallway and tiptoed out of his room. The window at the end of the hallway lit up the darkness with blue moonlight as he padded his way down. He could hear footsteps rustling around him, and faint giggling, lit by a pitter-patter of small feet, which sounded like a child had run in front of him, giggling and running around. The hallway was a lot longer than he had remembered. Seemed endless, like the ride home from the hospital. He heard a door creak in front of him. "Mom?" he called out in a shaky voice. Suddenly a door slammed behind him and he jumped and turned around. Behind him, he heard a long, eerie groan from behind him. the sound to croak right in his ear. He turned around as fast as he could, and he suddenly face to face with none other than his dead sister. Her eyes were clouded white, her skin pale, and her right side of her jaw only dangling on by tissue and muscle, glass protruding from her forehead, and black blood leaking down her face, her blonde hair pulled up back in a ponytail as it always was, wearing her gray t-shirt and athletic shorts, which were dirtied and spotted with blood. Her legs were bent in ways they shouldn't be. She stood, emitting a long croaking noise, only inches away from Toby's face. Toby yelped and fell back. Ah! He started to crawl backwards away from her, not able to break eye contact with her. Blank, dead eyes. He dragged himself backwards until he backed up into something. He stopped for a second. Everything was dead silent except for his heavy breathing and crying. He slowly looked up to meet the blank face of a tall, dark figure that stood over him. Behind the tall, dark mass was rows of children looking to range from 3 to 10. Their eyes completely black, and dark black blood leaked from their eye sockets. He screamed and stood up as fast as he could, only to be tripped by the dark black tendrils that wrapped around his ankle. He fell straight to his stomach and got the wind knocked out of his chest. He tried to scream out, but he couldn't make a sound. He wheezed out before it all went black. Toby woke up with a start, screaming out, and sat up as fast as he could, completely short of breath. He wheezed out and held his chest with his bandaged hand. It was just a dream. Just a dream. He laid back down on his head and rolled over to his side. It felt like a giant weight has been lifted off his chest as he took in a deep breath. He stood up and padded over to his window. He saw nothing. Nobody was out there. No ghost. No figures. Nothing. He heard rustling and coughing of his father out the doorway. His door was closed. He walked over and opened it, looking out into the hallway once again. He padded down the hallway into the kitchen, where he found his dad standing and having a smoke in the living room. Toby waited a second and watching him from the corner before a burning feeling started deep in his chest. Deep boiling anger took over him. He heard the little imaginary voices in his head. Do it, do it, do it, do it, do it. They chanted. He turned away and held his arms. He felt like he actually had control over himself, like he did in the past few weeks since he got home from the hospital. He actually had complete thoughts for just a moment, before they were clouded by the chanting of the little voices in his head. Kill him. Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him. Kill him. He continued on, till he trembled. No, he wasn't going to do it. What? Was he going crazy? No, he won't kill anyone. He can't. He hated his father, but no way. He was going to kill him. That was it. The last thought he had before he fell into an idle state once again. The influence of the voices in his head was too much. He began to silently walk up behind his father. He reached over to the counter to the knife holder in the kitchen and pulled out the largest knife that had been resting in the case. He gripped it in his hand. He felt a sensation take over his chest. He let out a snicker. He began laughing so hard that he had to gasp for breath. His father turned around abruptly before he felt a brute force shove him into the floor. He grunted as the hair was knocked out of him. What? He looked up at the boy who stood over him, grasping the kitchen knife in his hand. Toby, what are you doing? He went up to sit up and put his arms out in front of him in self-defense before he knew it. Toby was on top of him. He went to grab at his neck, but his father reached down and blocked his hand by grabbing onto his wrist. "Stop! Get off me, you little fucker!" He yelled, and his other hand, he threw an off-center punch towards Toby's shoulder. But he didn't stop. The look in Toby's eyes was not sane. It looked as if a demon taken control over him. He yelled back and went to stab the knife into his father's chest, but he blocked him and grabbed onto his wrist once again. He went to shove him back, but Toby kicked out his feet in front of him and landed a hard blow straight into his face. His father recoiled and pulled his arms away to cuff his face, but Toby got back up and drove the knife straight into his shoulder. His father let out a loud cry and went to pull the knife out. Before he could, Toby threw his fist, grabbed the knife and ripped it out of his shoulder. He drove it deep into his dad's chest, repeatedly stabbed into his torso, blood spilling out of it and getting splattered everywhere. He didn't stop until his father's body went still. He threw the knife over to the side and leaned over his body, coughing and panting. He stared at the smashed face and sat there twitching, until a loud scream broke the silence. He looked over to see his mother standing a few feet away, covering her mouth, tears streaming down her eyes. "Toby!" she screamed. "Why did you do that?" she cried. "Why?" she screamed. Toby stood up and began to back away from his father's bloody corpse. He began to back out of the kitchen. He looked down at the blood-soaked bandages on his hand and looked up at his mother one last time before he turned and ran out of the house. He ran into the garage and slammed his hands against the control panel on the wall and pushed the button to open up the garage door. Before he ran out, his father's two hatchets that had been hanging on the tool rack above a table full of jars, filled to the brim with old rusted nails and screws. One hatchet was new. It had a bright orange handle and a shiny blade. The other was an old wooden handle and an old dull blade. He grabbed both and looked down at the table, and his eyes met a box of matches, and under the table was a red gasoline tank. He held both of the hatches in one hand and grabbed the matches and gasoline before running out of the garage, down the driveway and up the street. As he approached the street lights that he could see out of his bedroom window, he heard police sirens in the distance. He turned around and the red-blue flashing lights came rushing down the street. Toby stood for a second before he pulled open the cap on the gasoline tank and ran down the street, spilling gasoline all over the street after him, and turned to run into the trees. He poured the last bit of gasoline out before he reached into his pocket and pulled out a match. He struck it against the box immediately and dropped it. In an instant, flames bursted out around him. The fire caught onto the trees and bushes around him, and before he knew it, he was surrounded by fire. The silhouette of police cars were visible through the flames as he backed away into the forest around him. He looked around, but his vision was blurred. His heart was pounding, and he closed his eyes for a moment. This was it. This was the end. Toby felt a hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked around to see a large white hand with a long bony finger that rested on his shoulder. He followed the arm that was attached to the hand up to a towering dark figure. He appeared to be wearing a dark black suit, and his face was completely blank. It towered over Toby's small frame and looked down at him. Tendrils reached out from its back. Before Toby knew it, his vision was blurred, and he was surrounded by the sound of ringing in his ears. Everything went blank. That was it. That was the end. That was how Toby Rogers died. A few weeks later, Connie sat in her sister's kitchen. His sister, Lori, sat next to her drinking a cup of coffee. About 3 weeks ago, Chloe lost her husband and her son, and a few weeks before, she lost her daughter to a car crash. Since then, she moved in with her sister. The police were keeping her busy. They had just finished cleaning up the case, and the story had been released 2 weeks ago. The focus of the world seemed to have been shifted to a completely new story. Lori switched on the TV to a new news broadcast on the TV. The new reporter began introducing the new headline. "We have breaking news. Last night there had been reported murders of 4 individuals. There are no suspects yet, but the victims were a group of middle school kids who had been out in the woods late at night. The kids had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. The investigators had discovered a weapon at the crime scene, which appeared to be an old, dull-bladed hatchet, as you can see here. The picture changed to a show snapshot of the weapons exactly as it was left on the crime scene. Investigators had pulled the name of the possible suspect, Toby Rogers, a 17-year-old boy who a few weeks ago had stabbed his father to death and tried to cover up his escape by setting a fire in the street in the forest area around the neighborhood. Although they had believed the young boy had died in the fire, investigators suspect that Roger may still be alive, due to the fact that the body was never found.